The coronavirus pandemic has multi-layered gender impacts, affecting women and men very differently. It is clear that the pandemic represents one of the most significant threats to gender equality gains in the Asia Pacific region in several decades. Let me share three main impact channels. Firstly, in relation to job losses, women's jobs have been severely impacted because women are more concentrated in the sectors that are most hard hit, such as tourism. In Asia and the Pacific, women's labor force participation was already declining before the pandemic, and it is the only region where this is the case. Women's jobs are also more vulnerable in terms of the informal sector because they lack the social protection floor to support them in periods of crisis. Secondly, the increased volume of unpaid care work. Women have borne the burden of caring for sick family members, helping children with schoolwork during distance learning, and additional household chores. This has fallen disproportionately on the shoulders of women and girls. Even before the pandemic, women already spent 4 times more than men on unpaid care work. So this increased burden has hit women harder and made it difficult for many women to stay in their jobs in paid employment. Last but not least, the economic and social stress of the pandemic has led to economic increases in domestic violence. Across Asia and the Pacific, there were reports that requests for women seeking help have increased by almost 50% during the pandemic, and therefore this is being called the shadow pandemic. Women's leadership is often characterized with traits such as consultation, collaborative, and participatory approaches, and also a focus on ensuring that nobody is being left behind. These are some of the leadership traits that have been associated with political leaders such as Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, where we all know that pandemic management has led to one of the lowest infection and mortality rates in the world. But most importantly, whether it's responding to a pandemic or leading a business or leading at community level, there is a lot of evidence that shows that gender diversity leads to positive outcomes. Unfortunately, women remain largely underrepresented politically globally, with less than a quarter of women parliamentarians across the globe. Let's hope that these positive role models of female leadership will become the norm in the new normal. COVID-19 threatens the important progress made for gender equality, and therefore to address it, governments will require very strong and deliberate commitment to protect these hard-won gains. There are a few key actions for governments to consider. The first one is really deliberately ensuring that a gender lens is applied when designing recovery programs. And this means looking at how the pandemic is affecting women and men differently, for example, in terms of job losses, and designing targeted solutions rather than a one-size-fits-all, or what some gender specialists would call avoiding a gender-blind approach. Secondly, it's important to assure that there are enough resources allocated to targeting addressing gender issues. These could be through gender-responsive budgeting, for example, which also promotes greater transparency and accountability in the budget management process. And thirdly, and some would argue most importantly, it's very critical to address discriminatory social gender norms which underpin gender equality, whether that be in the job market or the education sector or many other areas. And this will be critical to enabling member governments to address Sustainable Development Goal 5. Focusing on women in recovery efforts makes sense from an economic as well as a development perspective. We know that job losses have been higher amongst women than men. Therefore, it is imperative that recovery strategies prioritize creating decent work opportunities for women as they re-enter the labour market. Economies need the full range of talent and skills of their population to contribute to growth and cannot afford to leave women further behind. A recent ADB policy brief on Mongolia found that closing the gender gap in labour force participation could lead to a 16% increase in GDP over the next 30 years. The potential for growth as well as gender equality is enormous and is a viable economic strategy. Beyond the economy, a women-focused recovery goes hand in hand with building back better. It holds the promise of inclusion and sustainable growth by removing barriers to women's empowerment in all aspects of life, be it at household level, in public life, through education, or in the labor market. Well, since the earliest days of the pandemic in 2020, ADB mobilized very quickly to support its developing member countries to respond to this unprecedented crisis in our region. Gender equality has been at the heart of our response, and we're very proud, for example, that all of our COVID-19 rapid response packages have mainstreamed gender equality, setting gender targets across employment, social protection, and health programs, as well as supporting gender-based violence response. We have complemented this with technical assistance to help member countries track and monitor these programs from a gender perspective. In addition, we are also actively strengthening the understanding of gender impacts through supporting rapid assessments and surveys to measure the gender impact of the pandemic. Sex disaggregated data is critical to design evidence-based programs and respond to women's needs that can mitigate and protect the challenges to gender equality that have emerged from the crisis.